I've always found that the loudest people in an office are usually the ones with the least to say. They rely on the click of expensive heels, the rustle of dry clean jackets, and titles that sound like they were generated by a marketing team trying to sell juice to teenagers. I, on the other hand, preferred the quiet. I was 34 years old, and for 6 years, I had occupied a desk in the mid-level operations department of Finch& Associates. My job was simple on paper: audit the transaction pipelines, verify compliance records, and make sure the numbers matched the contracts. I was the guy who sat in the corner, wore plain gray suits, and went home at exactly 5 p.m. Most of my coworkers treated me like office furniture, which was exactly how I liked it. When you are invisible, people talk freely around you. They leave spreadsheets open on their screens. They whisper in the break room. And they completely forget that you are paying attention. But everything changed on a Monday morning in the third-floor conference room. It was 9 a.m., and the weekly strategy meeting was underway. 14 people were crammed around the long oak table, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of laptops and the overhead fluorescent lights. At the head of the table sat George Thorne, our vice president of strategy. George was a man who had spent his entire career climbing the corporate ladder by using other people's work as rungs. Next to him sat his 24-year-old daughter, Chloe Thorne, who held the title of Junior Associate of Strategic Growth. It was a title George had invented for her, straight out of her expensive business school. Chloe had spent her first 3 months at the firm treating the office like her personal social media feed. She spoke in a loud, grating voice, mispronounced basic financial terms, and spent most of her day shopping online or taking selfies in the glass reflection of the boardroom. Chloe was wearing a bright red designer blazer and had a massive Starbucks cup in her hand. She was looking around the room, searching for someone to feed her ego. Her eyes settled on my hand. I was holding a blue pen, writing notes on a yellow legal pad. On my right ring finger was a simple, worn gold band. It wasn't flashy. The edges were soft and rounded from years of friction, and the surface was covered in tiny, faint scratches that obscured a once intricate engraving. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, it looked like a piece of cheap brass you'd find at the bottom of a box at a yard sale. "I love your ring," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick it was almost impressive. She dragged out the words like she was auditioning for a cheap reality show. "It is giving major thrift store chic. Is that actual brass, or did Goodwill start carrying historical props?" The room went dead silent. The low hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded like a roar. 12 other employees immediately looked down at their keyboards, or suddenly found the insides of their coffee mugs fascinating. Nobody wanted to catch George Thorne's eye. George let out a low chuckle, pretending to clear his throat, but the message was clear. He found his daughter's cruelty amusing. I didn't flinch, I didn't laugh, and I didn't pull my hand away. I just looked at the ring, then looked back at Chloe. I gave her a small, polite nod, the kind you give to a child who doesn't know any better. Still, I said nothing. I turned the ring gently on my finger, feeling the familiar weight of it. "I mean, no offense," Chloe added, looking around the table for approval from the junior analysts. "I just love vintage. I just didn't realize we were doing peasant cosplay in a strategy meeting." I kept my eyes on her. I knew something she didn't. I knew that in exactly 2 hours, Julian Cole, the firm's largest and most powerful client, was arriving for a critical review, and I knew that Julian would recognize this ring, because this ring wasn't mine. It was a reminder, a promise, and a key to a vault that George and Chloe Thorne didn't even know existed. I had worn that ring every single day for the last 11 years. I wore it through late nights of analyzing data, through the cold winter days when the office heating failed, and even through the week I spent sitting on a hard vinyl chair in a hospice room, holding my father's hand as we waited for the end. The doctors told me Arthur Vance wouldn't last the night. But my father was a man who didn't take orders from anyone, least of all doctors. He survived that night, and the week after, and he was still very much alive, watching the world from his quiet estate in Maine. He had given me the ring with a simple piece of advice. "Stay invisible, Clark. Let them think you are nobody, because the moment they see you, they will try to own you. But when the time is right, show them the foundation." Chloe Thorne didn't understand foundations. She only understood the surface. She leaned back in her chair, looking smugly at her phone, convinced she had just asserted her dominance over the quiet guy from operations. The meeting resumed. George Thorne droning on about dynamic market integration and client retention strategies, completely unaware that the fuse had already been lit. I sat with my hands folded, the old gold ring catching the dim light of the projector, a silent countdown running in my head. The history of Finch and Associates was built on a lie that everyone in management had agreed to believe. If you read the official company brochure, the firm was founded on pure grit, visionary leadership, and strategic brilliance. But the truth was far less glamorous. In 2003, during the height of the market downturn, the firm was 24 hours away from filing for bankruptcy. Their major clients had pulled out, their credit lines were frozen, and the board was preparing to liquidate their assets. That was when Arthur Vance, my father, stepped in. He didn't use his own name. He operated through a series of shell corporations and holding companies, injecting $15,000 zirin of cash into the business in exchange for a silent partnership. It was a deal done in the shadows. The board got the money they needed to survive, but they had to sign a strict legacy agreement. The agreement dictated that Arthur Vance held a permanent, non-dilutable equity stake in the company. More importantly, it established a trust that allowed his designated heir to work within the company at any level, completely insulated from executive oversight or termination. To ensure the agreement could never be forged or denied, my father had two identical gold rings cast. One was locked in a private vault in Geneva alongside the original contracts. The other was on my finger. I had spent the last 6 years at the firm using my access to audit the transactions. I wasn't just doing my job. I was performing a quiet, continuous audit of the company's integrity. And over the last 18 months, the integrity of the firm had begun to rot. George Thorne, the VP of Strategy, had been siphoning funds. In my role in operations, I had flagged a $240,000 internal discrepancy in a global transfer account. It was a clean, quiet transfer that had been categorized as an operational consulting expense. But when I dug into the transaction logs, there was no vendor, no invoice, and no delivery report. The authorization signature belonged to George Thorne, but the security credentials used to log into the terminal belonged to Chloe Thorne. This was a direct violation of corporate compliance and state law. Under California Penal Code Section 470, using another employee's digital credentials to authorize the transfer of company assets constitutes forgery. In addition, George's actions were a clear breach of fiduciary duty and represented a dissipation of company assets for personal gain. I had traced the funds to a private offshore account that had recently paid for a lease on a luxury apartment in Los Angeles and a series of high-end credit card bills, all under Chloe's name. They were treating the firm's capital as their personal bank account, thinking no one was looking. I had compiled the evidence into a secure, encrypted folder on my local drive. I was waiting for the right moment. I didn't want to just file a report that George could easily bury with his influence on the board. I needed a catalyst, and that catalyst was about to walk through the front doors. At 3:02 p.m., the elevator doors on the executive floor slid open. The ambient noise of the corridor died instantly. Julian Cole had arrived. Julian was the founder of Cole Capital, a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund that provided 40% of Finch & Associates' annual revenue. He was a tall man, 60 years old, with broad shoulders and a sharp, calculating gaze. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a black leather folio. He walked with a stiff, deliberate gait that commanded respect. The receptionist stood up immediately, her face flushed with anxiety, and George Thorne appeared from his office, his face stretched into a wide, performative grin. I was walking down the hallway, carrying a stack of compliance reports to the copier. I was dressed in my usual plain gray suit, keeping my eyes down, looking like just another mid-level employee. As Julian Cole walked past me, our paths crossed. It was a brief moment in the corridor, a space of 4 feet. Then Julian stopped. He didn't just slow down. He came to a dead halt. His eyes dropped to my hand, which was holding the paper folder. His gaze locked onto the worn gold ring on my finger. The air in the hallway seemed to drop in temperature. Julian stared at the ring, his face turning pale. He blinked, looking up at my face, then back down at my hand. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. George Thorne, who was walking beside Julian, stopped as well, looking confused. "Is everything all right, Mr. Cole?" George asked, his voice dripping with sycophantic concern. "We have the presentation ready in the main boardroom." Julian didn't look at George. He took a step toward me, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I stood my ground, my expression neutral. I looked at the ring on my finger, then looked up to meet his eyes. "My father gave it to me," I said simply. Julian's chest tightened. He looked at my face again, searching my features for a resemblance he hadn't noticed before. He knew the name Arthur Vance. He knew the history of 2003. He knew that the man who had saved this firm and backed his own first fund was the owner of that ring. "Excuse me, Clark," George Thorne snapped, stepping between me and Julian. He had a look of pure irritation on his face. "Mr. Cole is a busy man. We don't have time for your vintage jewelry discussions. Go back to your desk." I didn't answer. I just gave Julian Cole a quiet, respectful nod, turned on my heel, and walked down the hallway. I could feel Julian's eyes on my back the entire way. He was a smart man. He had already connected the dots. The quiet analyst in operations wasn't just a mid-level employee. He was the heir to the ghost ledger, and the firm was currently treating him like garbage. The presentation in the main boardroom had all the atmosphere of a high-stakes interrogation. The lights were dimmed, the air conditioner hummed, and George Thorne stood at the head of the table, gesturing at a massive slide deck. He was talking about dynamic client integration and strategic capital allocation, using every corporate buzzword he could find to mask the lack of actual substance in his pitch. Chloe Thorne sat near the front, her legs crossed, scrolling through her phone, completely disinterested in the business at hand. At the other end of the table sat Julian Cole. He hadn't touched his coffee. He hadn't opened his notebook. He was sitting in silence, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the empty space in the middle of the table. He looked like a man who was calculating the cost of a disaster. I was sitting in the second row, near the back wall, holding my legal pad. I wasn't supposed to speak. I was only there to provide the compliance data if Julian's analysts asked for it. George was mid-sentence, explaining how Finch & Associates would optimize Cole Capital's Q4 portfolio, when Julian Cole raised a single finger. The silence that followed was immediate. George froze, his mouth open, his pointer finger still hovering over the screen. He blinked, looking at Julian. "Mr. Cole?" Julian didn't look at George. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He walked down the side of the table, his steps echoing on the hardwood floor. The other partners and analysts watched him in silence, their eyes tracking his movement. Julian stopped right in front of my chair. He looked down at me, his face grave. "Where did you get that ring?" Julian asked, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire room tense. The partners shifted in their seats, exchanging confused glances. Chloe Thorne finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance. I stood up slowly, meeting his gaze. "My father gave it to me before he retired to Maine," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "His name is Arthur Vance." The reaction was instant. Julian Cole's face went from pale to a deep, hollow gray. He took a step back, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. The name Arthur Vance was legendary among the older partners, though the younger ones like Chloe looked completely blank. "Is everything okay, Mr. Cole?" George Thorne asked, his voice cracking slightly. "If Clark is causing some sort of disruption, I can have security escort him out immediately." Julian turned slowly to face George. His voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the warmth he usually showed. "This pitch is over," Julian said. George blinked. "I'm sorry." "I said this pitch is over," Julian repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Whatever deal you thought we were signing today, it is canceled. Cole Capital is pulling its accounts from this firm." A collective gasp ran through the room. The partners looked like they had just watched a train derail. George's face went completely white. "Mr. Cole, please. If there has been some sort of misunderstanding with Clark, we can handle it. He is just a mid-level analyst. We can terminate his contract today." Julian looked at George with a mixture of disgust and pity. "You don't even know what you are standing on, do you, George?" Julian said. He looked back at me, gave a respectful nod, and said, "We will speak soon, Clark." Then, Julian walked out of the room, his analysts scrambling to collect their laptops and follow him. The door shut with a heavy click. The boardroom was dead silent. George Thorne stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling. He looked at me, his eyes wide with rage. "What did you do?" he hissed. "What did you say to him?" I didn't answer. I picked up my legal pad, slipped my pen into my pocket, and walked out of the room. I went back to my desk and logged into my workstation. I opened the encrypted compliance folder. I knew the timeline now. The moment Julian Cole walked out, the board would go into a panic. They would search for the name Arthur Vance. They would look at the legacy files from 2003. And they would find the Ghost Ledger. The Ghost Ledger was the secret agreement that had saved Finch and Associates from bankruptcy 20 years ago. In exchange for the $15 million cash injection, the firm had signed a contract co-signed by Arthur Vance. The contract stated that the Vance family held a permanent, non-dilutable 30% equity stake in the firm. More importantly, it contained a protective clause. The designated heir of the Vance estate had the right to audit the firm's operations at any time, and any attempt by the executive management to terminate, demote, or interfere with the heir's work would immediately void the agreement. If the agreement was voided, the firm would be legally required to repay the original $15 million capital, plus 20 years of compounded interest at a rate of 8%. The total payout would exceed $72,400,000. It was a financial poison pill designed to protect the family from corporate betrayal. I checked my email. A notification popped up from the internal network. Subject: Compliance Review Request. It was an automated system alert, indicating that my profile had been locked for administrative review under George Thorne's authorization code. He was trying to lock me out. He thought he could silence the analysts before the board realized who I was. But George was playing a game he didn't understand. He didn't know that my father had taught me how to write code before I could write contracts. And he didn't know that the keys to the lock were already on my finger. By Tuesday morning, the tension in the office had become physical. People walked quickly through the corridors, their eyes darting to my corner desk. The whispers were constant. I could hear them in the break room, near the water cooler, and in the copy alcove. Everyone knew that Julian Cole had walked out of the strategy meeting because of me, but no one knew why. At 10 a.m., my phone rang. It was the internal line. "Clark, come to my office immediately." George Thorne's voice barked through the speaker before the line went dead. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked to the executive wing. When I entered the office, George was pacing behind his large mahogany desk. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie was crooked, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept. Chloe Thorne was sitting on the leather sofa, her arms crossed, her face twisted in a look of pure venom. "Close the door," George said. I shut the heavy glass door behind me and stood in front of the desk, keeping my hands folded. "You are done here," George said, pointing a finger at me. "I don't care what kind of game you are playing with Julian Cole. I don't care who your father is. You undermined my strategy presentation. You cost this firm a multi-million-dollar deal. That is active sabotage and insubordination. I have already instructed HR to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you from the building." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at George, then at Chloe. "You can't fire me, George," I said, my voice quiet and level. George let out a loud, mocking laugh. "I am the vice president of strategy, Clark. I have the authority to terminate any mid-level analyst in this department. Your badge is already deactivated." I took a step forward. Under the legacy agreement signed in 2003, co-signed by Arthur Vance and the founding partners, the Vance estate holds a permanent, non-dilutable equity stake in this firm, I said. That agreement contains a protective clause for the designated heir. Any attempt to terminate or demote me immediately voids the contract, requiring Finch and Associates to repay the original capital plus 20 years of compounded interest. The total amount is currently $72,400,000. If you sign that termination paper, you will bankrupt this company by noon. George's laugh died in his throat. He stared at me, his face turning a blotchy red. "What nonsense are you talking about? That agreement is a myth. The Ghost Ledger is just a rumor." "It's not a rumor, George," I said. I have already retrieved the original contract from the Geneva Records vault. It was sent to the board chairwoman this morning, but that wasn't the only thing I had sent. I looked at Chloe, who was staring at me with a sudden look of anxiety. There is also the matter of the $240,000 internal discrepancy in the global transfer account, I continued, my voice steady. Over the last 18 months, someone has been siphoning funds from the operational consulting budget. The authorization signature belongs to you, George, but the digital credentials used to log into the terminal and execute the transfers belong to Chloe. George stood frozen, his eyes wide, under California Penal Code, Section 470. Using another employee's digital signature to authorize the transfer of assets constitutes forgery. It carries a maximum sentence of 3 years in state prison. In addition, siphoning corporate assets for personal use is a direct breach of fiduciary duty and a dissipation of company assets. I have the transaction logs, the IP addresses, and the offshore account records that show exactly where that money went. It was used to pay for Chloe's luxury apartment lease and luxury credit card bills. This is a lie, Chloe shrieked, standing up from the sofa. You are fabricating this. Dad, tell him he is lying. George didn't speak. He looked like he had just been hit by a truck. He knew the logs were real. He knew I had them. And there is one more thing, I said, looking at George. Yesterday afternoon, you submitted a proposal to the board for a sudden layoff of 4 operational analysts, including myself, to cut costs and hide the financial discrepancy. Under the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as the Warren Act under 29 U.S.C. 2101, a company of this size must provide at least 60 days written notice before conducting a mass layoff or terminating key operational staff. Trying to terminate us without that notice is a federal violation, exposing the firm to civil penalties and back pay liability. George opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a word, the office door opened. Evelyn Sinclair, the chairwoman of the board, walked in. Behind her stood Fiona, the general counsel, Peter, the compliance officer, and 2 security guards. Evelyn Sinclair was a silver-haired woman with an icy, commanding presence. She was holding a thick manila folder sealed with red wax. Mr. Thorne, Evelyn Sinclair said, her voice like cracking ice. We need to have a discussion about your employment. The silence in George Thorne's office was heavy and suffocating. Evelyn Sinclair walked to the center of the room, placing the wax-sealed folder on the mahogany desk. She looked at George, then at Chloe, and finally at me. Her expression was one of cold, professional disappointment. The board has reviewed the documents, Sinclair said. The legacy agreement signed in 2003 is valid. Clark Vance is the designated heir of Arthur Vance, and his employment is fully protected under the legacy clauses. George sputtered, his hands clutching the edge of his desk. Evelyn, please, this is a setup. He has been auditing our files without authorization. He is trying to extort us. He wasn't auditing without authorization, Fiona, the general counsel, said, stepping forward. Under the legacy agreement, the Vance heir has full, unrestricted audit authority over all operational and financial systems. His access was fully legal. In addition, Peter from compliance added, holding up a printout of the transaction logs. We have verified the $240,000 discrepancy. The IP addresses used to execute the transfers matched George's home network, and the credentials used were Chloe's. We also verified the offshore account deposits. This is a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470 for forgery and a breach of fiduciary duty. We have already notified our external auditors and the authorities. George sank back into his leather chair, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had spent his life building a house of cards, only to watch the wind blow it away. And what about the Warren Act violation? Sinclair asked, looking at George. You tried to execute an immediate termination of operational staff to cover your tracks. That alone would have exposed this firm to a federal lawsuit and regulatory sanctions. Evelyn, Chloe sobbed, stepping toward the desk. It was just a mistake. I didn't know. My dad told me it was fine. He said I was untouchable. Sinclair didn't look at her. She signaled to the security guards. George Thorne, Chloe Thorne, you are terminated from Finch & Associates. Effective immediately, Sinclair said. Your access badges have been revoked, and your personal items will be mailed to you. The guards will escort you from the building. The guard stepped forward. George didn't argue. He stood up slowly, his head bowed, and walked out of the office. Chloe followed him, her mascara running down her face, crying and screaming that she would sue the firm. The office door shut, and the noise of her complaints faded down the hallway. Evelyn Sinclair turned to me. She looked at the worn gold ring on my finger, then met my eyes. "Clark," she said, "on behalf of the board, we apologize for how you were treated. Your father was a great partner to this firm, and we want to honor that legacy. We would like to offer you George Thorne's position as the Vice President of Strategy. We will give you a permanent seat on the board and full voting rights." I looked at Sinclair. I looked at Fiona and Peter. I could see the anxiety in their eyes. They were afraid that if I said no, I would void the agreement and demand the return of the $72,400,000 capital, which would destroy the firm. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small black velvet box, and opened it. I took the worn gold ring off my finger. The skin underneath was pale and indented from 11 years of wear. I placed the ring inside the box, closed the lid, and set it on the desk. "I didn't come here for a VP title," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "I didn't come here for power or a seat on the board. I came here to audit the foundation. I wanted to see if the firm my father saved was still worth saving." Sinclair stared at the box, her face tight. "And what is your verdict?" she asked. "You failed," I said. "You allowed nepotism, arrogance, and incompetence to run this place. You let people like George and Chloe Thorne treat the workers who build this company like garbage. You only cared about compliance when it threatened your bottom line." I turned and picked up my briefcase. "I am leaving the firm," I said. "I will not void the agreement today, and I won't shut the firm down. But I am relocating the Vance Family Trust capital to a new venture. The $15,000 will remain as a passive investment, but you will no longer have our backing or our protection. You are on your own." I walked out of the office. I walked through the open-plan bullpen, past the empty desk where I had spent 6 years of my life. The other employees watched me in silence. No one snapped their fingers. No one made a joke about my clothes or my jewelry. They just watched me walk. I got into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors close. Downstairs, I walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air. I took a deep breath. For the first time in 11 years, my finger felt light. Within an hour, the firm's financial department detected a massive transfer. Cole Capital had officially withdrawn their accounts, and the Vance Trust had relocated their active assets. The stock price of Finch & Associates began to drop. The board was in a panic, calling emergency sessions, but the founder just sat in his office, staring at the small black velvet box. When he opened it, the worn gold ring lay inside, dull and silent. It was no longer a key, it was a gravestone. I got into my car and drove away, leaving the corporate tower behind. My father had been right. Staying invisible was a shield, but showing the foundation was the checkmate. Thanks for reading, everyone. If you enjoyed this corporate breakdown, subscribe to keep the channel going. Your support keeps the system running clean.